Hi, and welcome back to the Unseen podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we're going to be exploring the brutal killing of Jean Bradley in Acton in 1993. This murder became headline news at the time due to the circumstances that Jean's murder occurred, in the street with a witness. Despite these circumstances, Jean's murder is still unsolved, and this begs many more questions as to why. This episode contains descriptions that some people may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. The area of Acton is located in the London Borough of Ealing in West London. Acton has long been famous as an industrial hub, with many factories being located there, including the car firm Renault. Today, however, Acton is mainly made up of residential housing, including the largest housing estate in West London, with around 2,000 homes and nearly 6,000 residents. It's a very multicultural area, with people from many parts of the world choosing to settle down there. It's also famous for Gunnersbury Park, which is a large and popular park in the area where many events take place. Acton Town Tube Station, therefore, is a very important stop on the Underground, as many residents and commuters use it regularly to get into central London, and they use it to visit tourist attractions like Gunnersbury Park. It's a busy tube stop served by both the District and the Piccadilly lines. The tube stop is used by mainly people from the Acton area, but also people further afield who drive to the location and leave their car and get on the tube, so as to avoid traffic and congestion in central London. This is exactly why 47-year-old Jean Bradley had decided to park her car there in 1993 when she got a new job, which meant that she would be commuting into London. Jean lived in Crowthorne in Berkshire, but had recently got a job which had an office in New Bond Street in London. Jean worked for a company called Pricoa Relocation, which was an American company which specialised in helping companies move premises. Jean was happy with the job move, but was worried about the travelling situation, given that it was 30 miles away from her home. Jean and her partner Nicholas came up with a plan together to make the journey easier for her, and they decided that travelling around halfway and then getting on the tube would be the easiest route to take. This was how Jean ended up settling on Acton, as she could get the Piccadilly line into London from Acton Town Station. Jean was a thorough woman and wanted to know exactly what the area was like before she decided to park her car there, and her and Nicholas travelled to the area to check it out first. They assessed the safety of the roads in the area and believed that they were fine for her to leave the car, and Jean began her job and making the commute in from Acton. Jean would often leave her car early at around 7:30 and then travel back and arrive after tea time back to her car. On Thursday the 25th of March 1993, this is exactly what Jean did. She arrived in her BMW and parked it on Carberry Avenue in Acton, before travelling the short distance to Acton Town Tube Station to go to work. Her partner Nicholas was a teacher during this time, and he was on a school trip in Rome. Nicholas later reported that he spoke to Jean regularly while he was away, and she was eager to hear all about the trip, as a week after Nicholas arrived home, they were going on their own trip to Rome, and Jean was excited. That day, Jean arrived at work and did her workday as usual, before returning back to Acton on the Piccadilly line from Green Park. When Jean arrived back into Acton, it's reported that she nipped into some shops to grab something to drink for the evening before returning back to her car. This was around 7:20 p.m, and while there were people around in the streets, they weren't crowded as they would have been earlier in the evening. One woman remembers passing Jean walking along the road that night. Jean arrived back at her car on Carberry Avenue and started to put things inside the open door. This was such a usual and everyday occurrence. However, this wasn't the case that night. As Jean was leaning into her car, someone attacked her from the back. This seemed to be an unprovoked attack on an oblivious victim. It would later be established that this was not only an unprovoked attack, but it was a brutal one. Jean was suddenly attacked by a man with what was later found to be an 8-inch knife. The man began stabbing Jean and the pair ended up tussling on the floor. This attack seemed to come out of nowhere, and despite the fact that it was now dark, Acton was still a relatively busy area, with people travelling along Carberry Avenue at the time that it took place. Patrick Cunningham, who was employed as a carpenter, was driving along in his van at the exact time that the attack took place, and he witnessed it firsthand. He confronted the attacker as he began to run away, and he later recounted this to Crime Watch during the reconstruction. He said that the man had very cold eyes and was wearing a strange black hat. He was also very tall and held up what looked to be a black plastic bag in his hand. The bag, he noticed, looked rigid, as though there was something inside it. Patrick Cunningham wasn't the only person who was in the area at the time. A woman and her son were driving along Carberry Avenue in their car when they saw the man, and although they were initially unsure about the situation, they knew that the man must have done something, as he was acting suspiciously and was fleeing the scene. The woman noted that he looked very strange. He was around 6 foot to 6'3", and she described him as wearing a silly hat. It was black and was one that looked like a sou'wester hat, which is a plastic hat with an almost pointed top and a strap that hangs under the chin. It almost looks like a fisherman's hat. This was a distinctive hat in the area, particularly as it was cold, but it wasn't raining. The woman knew that the man had been up to something and told her son in the car to get out and head home to ring the police. She stayed in the car and proceeded to follow the man down the road. Patrick Cunningham was also doing this, and by that point had got out of the car and began chasing the suspect through the streets on foot. The woman in the car decided to go home to check that her son was indeed phoning the police, and she glanced back to see the suspect and Patrick Cunningham running down the road towards Acton Road tube station. The chase between Patrick Cunningham and the suspect continued as they went along North Circular Road before the man turned off towards South Acton Estate. Patrick Cunningham explained that along the way he tried to enlist as much help as he could from people passing by like pedestrians and stopping people in their cars to try and help, but in the end he continued chasing the suspect on foot and alone. When the suspect ran into South Acton Estate, Patrick Cunningham later told Crime Watch that he tried to hide behind trees and bushes so that the suspect would believe that he had stopped following him. Cunningham explained that the suspect rarely glanced back around but did slow down enough that he was able to mostly catch up with him. It was at this point in the chase that the suspect turned around and saw Patrick Cunningham and immediately started running again through the park on the estate. Cunningham noted that the suspect didn't seem very fit, as when he reached the edge of the estate there was a railing. He said he could have jumped it to get away faster, but the suspect chose not to. He kept running and rounded a corner, and when Patrick Cunningham himself got round the corner, he could no longer see him. Cunningham got close to a pub named the Prince of Wales, which was close to the intersection of Church Road and Ragley Close on the South Acton estate, and he began asking people if they'd seen him, but nobody he spoke to had. While Patrick Cunningham had lost sight of the suspect, there was another witness tracked down who had seen his next movements. This witness was a man who lived in a flat on the South Acton estate and had been out on his balcony at the time. He saw the suspect stop outside one of the flats on the ground floor. He looked very agitated and nervous and was moving side to side. He could see that the man had a hat in his hand and that he had jet black hair. He was wearing a cream-coloured 3/4 length jacket and trousers that looked too short for him as they were flapping around at the ankles. The witness said he walked quite oddly, like he was flat-footed, and held a black bag tightly in his hand and didn't let go of it once. The man said that the suspect looked around as though looking for a way out of the estate, and the witness said he headed off on Buckland Walk, which led out of the estate and towards the High Street. The witness said he realised something was off about this man, but by that time he was out of sight. He had travelled 1.5 miles from Carberry Avenue, where Jean was initially attacked. During this time, police and emergency services had been dispatched to the scene where Jean had been attacked. It was established that she had been stabbed several times with an 8-inch knife. This proved to be fatal, and Jean later passed away from her injuries. The attack seemed so completely impulsive and random that it was difficult to know exactly what had happened and why. It seemed like a completely random killing, and of course catching the person responsible for this was crucial to the police, given that nobody knew if this was the start of a killing spree for this individual. The fact that so many people did get a look at the suspect was important to the investigation, and it provided the police with some idea of who they were looking for. They knew from the information that had been given to them by Patrick Cunningham, who had given chase for over a mile, the woman in the car who'd been driving along, and from a witness at the flats on South Acton Estate, that they were looking for a tall and relatively thin-looking man with a gaunt face and stubble that was described as looking 2 days old. The noticeable thing that all of the witnesses pointed out was that the man seemed to be wearing a strange hat that looked like a sou'wester style and really stood out in that area. As the attack and the subsequent chase was seen by several people, it was hoped that someone may know something that could help the police. They turned to Crime Watch to appeal for information and provide the public with something that might jog their memories. Detective Superintendent Bob Fenton spoke on the show, indicating that the suspect had last been seen heading towards Acton High Street, and he appealed for anyone who may have seen someone fitting the description of the man to come forward. He did add, however, that he may not have continued travelling in that direction after he was last seen, and so he was also appealing for anyone that may have not only seen the man, but also the chase between the suspect and Patrick Cunningham. Detective Superintendent Bob Fenton explained that there appeared to be no motive for the attack on Jean, and that nothing had been stolen, despite Jean having placed her bag on the seat before being attacked. He added that the suspect appeared to be a strange character, and that his description may be recognisable to people working for certain agencies, such as social services or psychiatric services, who he might be known to, or even to local charity shops where he might have purchased his clothes. A hat similar to the one worn by the suspect was also shown on the show, and he appealed for anyone who might know someone who wears that type of hat or owns that type of hat to come forward. Detective Superintendent Fenton also explained that they wanted to trace a man who was working that day in Carberry Avenue, going door to door as a street vendor. He stated that he didn't want to look into whether the man should have been selling door to door that day, but just wanted to know what he knew, as it was hoped that he might have noticed the suspect loitering around the area before the murder. There was a new piece of evidence also shown on the episode, which police believe could be a crucial piece of information. A fragment of a plastic bag was found at the scene, and it was discovered that this did not belong to Jean or anyone else who had been at the scene that night. The fragment of the bag was about 8 or 9 inches and had some features that police believe that someone may recognise. The bag was black with gold details, including some images of flowers, along with some words that could be made out. There was a larger S visible, as well as the words extruded, printed, and in the United. but then nothing else was able to be discerned. Police were able to do some investigation later on and found out that it was from the brand Narcissus, and that it had been made by a manufacturing company in Ayrshire. It was explained that there was a £20,000 reward being offered for anyone who had information about Jean's murder, and this was offered up by Jean's employers at Prycoa. Jean's murder was so violent and unnecessary, given that there was no motive or reason evident to the police. Why had this happened, and why had this suspect chosen to do this at a very busy time in a very residential and commuter area like Acton? It was clear that the police believed that the suspect must have had either mental health or addiction issues, given what they reported on the Crime Watch segment, but narrowing this down was proving very difficult. Jean's family and her partner Nicholas had to come to terms with the unnecessary and brutal nature of Jean's passing, and they couldn't comprehend why or how this had happened. Nicholas later recounted to the newspapers the awful moment that he was told about the news that Jean had been murdered. Nicholas had been on a school trip with his job as a teacher, and it was in his hotel room during this trip that he was told of the news. He said it was only when he got back to Gatwick with the group that it began to sink in. He said, "I had to carry on with my job and get the children home. Initially, I put a brave face on it all. This gave way to shock when I was met by police at Gatwick." He added later, "Obviously the hardest thing I have to face is not having Jean around." The couple had been together for 21 years, and now Nicholas faced life without her. This must have been horrendous, particularly as it was proving difficult to find anyone who could have been behind the attack and murder. The murder seemed to hang over the area of Acton for several months afterwards, with the awful feeling that whoever committed this was still out there. In July of 1993, Patrick Cunningham spoke to the newspapers, explaining that he was still haunted by that night and the fact that he was unable to catch the suspect. He explained, "If I'd got the man to the ground, he would never have got up. All I needed was one person willing to help me. What I did I think any man should do if he's a man, but no one came to help. All I needed was one person to help me and the murderer would be behind bars today." He talked about how the incident has affected him, saying, "I pass the spot where the lady died every day of the week. Something drags me back. Sometimes I go around the area that I chased the killer through. I suppose I'm just hoping I will see him again." Patrick Cunningham had not only chased the suspect, but he'd confronted him, saying, "Come on, you bastard. Try me. I'm not a woman." Which is when the suspect began running. Patrick is clearly haunted by the fact that he couldn't catch the suspect, but the police openly applauded him for his actions. Superintendent Bob Fenton said, "What Pat did was very brave. If he hadn't done what he did, we wouldn't have half the information about the killer that we do." This information was clearly important to the investigation and gave some clues. And in August of 1993, it looked as though there was a development in Jean's case. It was announced that an arrest had been made. A 39-year-old by the name of Francis Marnell from Northolt in West London had been arrested. It was widely reported that Marnell was unemployed and had been interviewed at length about the murder. The arrest must have been welcome news to Jean's family and to the community, who wanted this violent murderer off the streets. Marnell appeared at Ealing Magistrates Court in September 1993 with his head covered with a blue blanket, and was then formally remanded in custody. The committal hearing took place in November 1993, and more information was announced. It was discovered that Francis Marnell was schizophrenic, and this may have been one of the reasons police believe that he could have been responsible for the murder. There was another bombshell piece of information announced. The case against Marnell wasn't going to proceed any further and the charges were being dropped. Magistrate Ian Comfort listened to the information provided by prosecution and defence and decided to dismiss the charges, given that Marnell seemed to have a watertight alibi for the time that the murder took place. A woman who worked at a social club in West Ealing told how she'd visited Marnell's flat with bedding that she'd collected for him, and she saw and spoke with him at the flat at that time. Marnell had a history of mental illness, but had always denied having anything to do with the murder. The prosecution, for their part, stated that Patrick Cunningham had picked Marnell out of an identity parade, saying that the killer looked really evil. Stephen Camlish, who led Marnell's defence, explained that police had ignored the evidence of an alibi that he had, and also hadn't bothered to conduct DNA tests that could have proven Marnell's innocence. Camlish stated that the alibi evidence was so strong that it was incapable of disbelief when looked at with an open mind. It would seem that Magistrate Ian Comfort agreed with him and decided that the case shouldn't proceed. There were reportedly gasps of astonishment, and Stephen Camlish announced that Marnell had been a victim of injustice at the highest level. Marnell made comment after the charges were dropped, saying, "We're going to have a party." This was not the outcome that the police had clearly hoped for, and Jean's family and loved ones were left back in limbo without the answers that they deserved. Police, for their part, stated that they would be speaking with the Crown Prosecution Service about this decision, but stressed that the Jean Bradley incident room remains open and there is still a team of officers working on the case who will be happy to receive any new information. After the case collapsed, the police investigation seemed to grind to a halt, with little progress being publicly made. A year after Jean's murder in 1994, her case was growing cold, and an article in the Gazette spoke to residents in Carberry Avenue and begged the question, what still was being done to catch the killer? Roy Follett, a resident in Carberry Avenue, spoke to the newspaper, saying, "The police seem to have dropped the case and we want to know what they're doing because nobody knows what's happening. Police here were very upset and it does not help knowing the man is still out there. He could do anything." These thoughts were echoed by several residents of Carberry Avenue and the surrounding streets. Many people were still distressed that the killer hadn't been found, and they wanted more information about what was being done. A spokesperson stated that the case was still open and would continue to be while it was unsolved, and it was also confirmed that more lighting had been added to Carberry Avenue. By this point, 342 suspects had been questioned and eliminated from the investigation. 1,800 statements had been made and 1,000 calls to police had been followed up on. However, despite this, Jean's murder remained unsolved. This is unfortunately the way that it has remained for 30 years, with the 30-year anniversary of Jean's murder being in March this year. There has been little new information released, and Jean's murder remains one of the most notorious unsolved murders in the capital. There has been lots of speculation about who could have possibly been responsible for this, as well as links to other crimes that were seen as similar. One of the crimes that have been discussed with reference to Jean's murder is that of Penny Bell, whose case we've covered on the podcast previously. 43-year-old Penny Bell's body was found in a car on the car park of the Gurnell Leisure Centre in Greenford in London. She had been stabbed over 50 times, and the motive for it was unknown. There didn't appear to be any reason behind the attack, and it happened during the day in a public place. During the Crime Watch segment about Jean Bradley's murder, Penny's was in fact brought up, due to the fact that it also happened in London and a woman had been attacked in public while they were by themselves. The similarities between the two, however, were quickly dispelled, as it was confirmed on there that police believe that the two murders were not connected. There wasn't any reason given for this, and of course Penny Bell's, like Jean's murder, is still unsolved. There has also been some other suspects brought up in relation to Jean's murder, including serial killer Robert Napper. Professor David Wilson, criminologist, amongst others, has suggested that he could have been responsible for the murder given his known MO. Napper had been convicted in 1994 for the murder of 27-year-old Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter in their home in Plumstead in London. What wasn't known at the time, though, was that he had already committed another brutal crime that somebody else had been wrongfully convicted for. The murder of Rachel Nickell on Wimbledon Common in southwest London in 1992 was a notorious, motiveless and awful crime, given that it had taken place in front of her 2-year-old son, and once again in a public place during daytime while walking the family dog. This was such a shocking murder, and what followed was a controversial investigation by the Metropolitan Police, in which a covert operation was established, focused on one of their potential suspects, Colin Stagg. Stagg was known to walk his dog on Wimbledon Common, and police sent out a female officer to try and form a relationship with Stagg. The police were working on a criminal profile that this suspect would enjoy violent fantasies, and the undercover officer tried to get Stagg to admit the murder by implying that she enjoyed hurting people too. Stagg never admitted to the murder, but he was arrested anyway. At trial, it emerged that his descriptions weren't close enough to the reality of the actual murder, as police had stated. And the judge exclaimed that the way in which police had gone about the investigation was using deceptive conduct of the grossest kind. There was no forensic evidence produced to link him to the murder, and his case was thrown out. He was acquitted through insufficient evidence. In the early 2000s, developments in DNA technology meant that a sample found on some of Rachel Nickell's clothes were able to be retested, and came back as a match to Robert Napper, who at that time was confined in Broadmoor Hospital. It was revealed that he had been questioned in relation to Nickell's murder in 1995 and had denied it. In 2008, he was convicted of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility given his mental state. The whole situation with Robert Napper was further exacerbated when speculation began to emerge that he could have been responsible for a string of rapes that occurred in southeast London called the Green Chain Rapes. 70 incidents related to this over a 4-year period were recorded, and Napper reportedly admitted to some of the incidents, which have been attributed to the Green Chain Rapist in 1995. He has been reportedly linked to 4 of these due to DNA matching. He had been ruled out of many of them, though, due to his height. It was thought that the suspect was around 5 feet 7 inches, and Napper was around 6'2" and so much taller. The witness statements, however, are conflicting, and it's reported that Napper did walk with a stoop. This description has caught the eye of some, given that the suspect in Jean Bradley's murder was described as tall and had a funny way of walking or running, as so described by Patrick Cunningham and the witness who saw the suspect from the top of the block of flats. He described him as flat-footed, but didn't mention a stoop. David Wilson also highlights the way in which Napper attacked his victims in a blitz-style attack, stabbing them multiple times, often in public places and without provocation. Interestingly, he also points out that Napper often travelled on public transport and knew his way around London extremely well. This was important in Jean's case, as he appeared to have set off in the direction of the tube station initially, and of course Jean was coming from the tube station when she was attacked. The ferocity of Rachel Nickell, Samantha Bissett and Jasmine Bissett's murders were of note also, as they were so brutal and violent that they could only have been perpetrated by someone who had a strong violent tendency and clear mental health issues, as Robert Napper had. This was a similar profile to that given for Jean Bradley's killer, particularly the focus that the police had on someone with no mental health issues or known addiction to drugs or alcohol. This, however, has never been confirmed, as have many of the details surrounding Jean's murder. A lot is still unknown almost 30 years later, and this must be horrendous for her family and loved ones, who just want answers to why this happened and who did it. Since Jean's murder, her name has been included in articles about other murders or crimes that occurred in London, and has been cited as one of the cases where DNA may help to solve her murder. Unfortunately, this has not been what has happened up until this point, and the evidence that they do have, or the information that leads to this speculation, is unclear. This would be the best case scenario for Jean's murder, and it's perfectly plausible that DNA may find her killer. I hope that this does happen in the future, given the time that has elapsed since. There is also always the possibility that someone could come forward with information, and Jean's case is still open, so any information, no matter how small, could be crucial. Many people saw what happened that night, and we have a lot more information than most crimes like this. However, despite this, the perpetrator still hasn't been found, and we have no idea if they went on to commit more crimes, or what happened to them since. This is a scary thought, and Jean's case, like all of the cases we cover on the podcast, deserve to be told and to be solved. Her loved ones deserve some closure, and they need answers. If you know anything about Jean Bradley's murder in 1993, then please contact the Metropolitan Police at 101. If you want to know more about the murder of Penny Bell in 1991, which was mentioned in this episode, then find it on our feed. I covered it back in January of 2021. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to support the podcast further, then you can on Patreon and contribute to exclusive polls to get extra bonus episodes every month. You can also get access to new episodes early and ad-free. You can use the link in the show notes to visit Patreon. You can also support us by reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, including Spotify, and also just share the episodes. You can subscribe on YouTube and follow us on social media. You can also now subscribe and listen to my new podcast, 10-Minute True Crime, which tells infamous crimes in a short form, bite-sized 10 minutes, for people on the go or who just like the facts. Find that wherever you listen and in the show notes. As always, I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.